Posted by u/Bika108. People who have worked as forensic photographers, what picture you took traumatized you for a long time? Obligatory not me but my dad. Back in the day before digital cameras, he had the only photo developing lab for 50 miles in a fairly well-known outdoor destination. With no other nearby services, he would develop the photos for all deaths, accidents, etc. It was pretty common for people to fall off the cliffs, and I bet those photos weren't the worst. According to him, the one that tops the list is a lost hiker who figured if he could climb up a cliff he'd be able to see where he was. So guy starts climbing and gets surprisingly far, but eventually gets to a spot he has to chimney up. Basically two flat parallel walls, and you climb them with the friction you get pushing off the walls. Guy makes it almost out but then loses it. From the blood smears on the wall you could see how he used his hands to try to stop his fall almost the whole way down. In the pictures the hands were worn through to the bone. Definitely not the way I'd want to go. My husband works with crime scene photos, and even though I could probably handle some of the photos, I'm not allowed to look, and I do respect the people's privacy of who he has pictures of. One day, for some reason, his phone was left unlocked/not properly closed and a picture was enlarged on the screen. Nothing crazy, just a younger kid with blank stare wearing a backpack, and he was on the playground by the chin-up bars. Not knowing it was his work phone, I asked who the kid was, maybe a colleague's kid, a friend, etc., to see if I knew him. Turns out it was a crime scene photo. Kid hung himself after school on the chin-up bars, which were much too short to hang on. In the next photo I saw the bottom half of his body, which broke my heart. His legs were bent. I always pictured hanging suicides as up high, the person struggling, maybe even regretting their decision. Seeing his legs bent showed how much determination he had to die. No blood, no guts, and still the most unsettling photo I've even seen. I used to work in a photo lab that developed pictures for a number of local police departments before the digital age came about. Since I was the lab manager, I was the one to develop those sensitive crime scene photos. Mind you, this was about 20 years ago, but some really stuck out. The worst? Definitely the death of a young child. He was around 2 to 3 years old. I believe it was death by strangulation, but it's not like we were told any details from the PD on pending investigations. We were just warned in advance. It was especially fucked up since the child's eyes were open and bulging. The skin was blue and even more purple around the neck and face. I can't get that shit out of my head. The craziest? A dismembered body in a Tupperware container. It was found on a rooftop loosely covered in concrete, and the body was there for easily a decade. The head and hands were missing. Just the torso, legs in pieces, and arms. What really stood out to me is that the torso resembled a dried out and cooked turkey. I ended up looking for an article years later to find out it was a mob hit. Others to note would be the usual gunshot fatalities and also fatal car crashes. I got pretty desensitized to seeing the images, and just focused on color correcting. But that young kid was beyond messed up. Classic, I'm not a photographer, but I'm a criminal defense attorney, so I look at a lot of crime scene and autopsy photos. The only one that really sticks with me is the first set of autopsy photos I saw. I got a folder with the core transcripts, filings, and documents for the case. There was an envelope clipped to the inside. I usually don't get multimedia evidence until a little later, so I figured it was a supplemental court document of some sort and popped the contents onto the desk. It was not. It was the medical examiner's photos of the victim. Lacerations all over their body, bone deep in places, with an apparently large blade. What got burned into my mind for whatever reason, was the subcutaneous fat. It wasn't at all like I expected fat to look, and for some reason that made it all the more disturbing. I was totally unprepared to see it, and I still curse whoever it was that didn't label B that envelope. Not a forensic photographer, but when I was a sophomore in college I took some criminal justice classes taught by an old ex-cop. He was friends with some equally old forensic photographers, and on occasion he'd show us photos and let us guess the method of death. We were nearly always wrong. The bulk of the photos were of elderly people who had died in their homes of natural causes but not been found for a while. Or if they had been found, it was by the flies or their hungry pets first. We always thought they'd been beaten to death. But the one that stuck in my mind and convinced me that no way in hell I could ever be a cop was the day he showed us pics of little kids who had been killed by their parents. This one toddler. His piece of crap father had repeatedly swung him by the heels, slamming his head into the toilet even after he died, until the toilet basin broke. The kid's crime? Not being toilet trained. That poor baby was not even 2 years old. If I'd been a cop on that case, I would have killed that sob and then spent the rest of my life in prison. Those pics wrecked everyone in my class. Was the last time the professor showed us kid pics. That was over 20 years ago and I still tear up to remember that damn photo. Not my picture but an old friend, 20+ years New York detective showed me a picture that to this day still irks me. A man, with a screwdriver stuck in his eye, with the tip sticking out of the back of the skull. All of his teeth were kicked into his mouth. Turns out his brother and he had argued over how much of some drug shipment they would divide up and the living brother decided he wanted it all. I mean, you stab someone in the eye it's one thing but to go overboard and just start kicking his face in with your shoe that you push all of his teeth into his throat. I fucking stared at that picture for 30 minutes and took a good day or two to stop replaying what was that guy's last few moments. He acted like it was a restaurant menu and just another Tuesday at work. We don't have full-time photographers, but as a police officer evidence tech the photo that sticks with me the most is a domestic violence suspect's hands. I took a photo of them just after he was arrested. They are handcuffed behind his back, showing his sagging pants and boxers, and the victim's blood covering his hands. He didn't have a scratch on him. He was active duty Navy and did some time for that. She lived. The photo alone fucked him in court and he took a plea deal. I paid for my camera, DSLR, out of my own pocket and felt good about getting my money's worth on that shot alone. I once curated an archive of forensic/crime scene photographs for a city's police department. They told me lots of times TV show/movie production staff would use the photos for reference, especially because the photos depict what actual home interiors looked like, inadvertently, over time. There was one set of photos from the 60s of a tidy suburban home and some poor middle-aged woman who had been raped and strangled in the middle of the day. The banal setting and the fact they depicted a real person and a real crime really haunted me. That was a difficult project, since every photo I looked at was something horrible. Obligatory not my story but my dad's. Please forgive any mistakes, English isn't my first language. Anyways, a bit of context before the story. We live in Mexico and my dad used to work for Kodak back in the 80s, when the earthquake of 1985 hit and it became obvious that the amount of bodies recovered overwhelmed the hospitals and morgues. The government started using an old baseball field to lay down the bodies so people with missing family could check if they were there. Anyways, it became horrible fast how much of a terrible idea it was. Bodies laid under the sun all day for days leave a pretty awful smell, so the government hired Kodak to take photos of the bodies and make an album for people to check, then threw all the bodies into a communal tomb. My dad was in charge of making these albums and checking that the photos were taken correctly. He always came back looking horrible, like he had seen a ghost. He used to tell me about the photos of people whose face was completely crushed, children, babies that some limbs were amputated by the debris. The government claimed a very low level of deaths compared to the unholy amount of photos Kodak took. Many bodies were never claimed or identified. He always hated talking about those days, even so I miss him. He was a great dad, but he sadly died of LA a few years back. Husband is a cop. He has told horrific ones, but the one that fucked him up most was a girl whose body looked like mine. Same hair color and style of dress. We were going through similar depression issues at the time. And this girl took a shotgun to her head. There wasn't a face left in for him. Because I was also very depressed at the time, and the bodies were so alike. He said all he could see was me lying there. Apparently her skull shattered so much that there was no surface without blood or bone on it, but her brain had ejected mostly intact. He had to go to therapy for a while after that one. I'm a trauma nurse. So usually when I see gore the person is still alive and that is a whole different ball game. But HIPAA laws exist so I won't be sharing. Obligatory not a forensic photographer, just a layperson. However, one photo that got to me, I saw on the internet for the first time when I was maybe 15 and I've never forgotten it. It's semi-famous in pro-ana communities. If you mention it, chances are someone will know what you're talking about. It was the autopsy of a 19-year-old girl with an ED whose mother posted it online hoping to warn other people, I believe. She died binging and purging because her stomach exploded, and the photo is of this pale, emaciated, almost inhuman-looking corpse with a distended stomach slumped over a toilet. Her limbs are purple with bruising from the blood settling. Another photo displays the new 5 or 6, I forget, measured liters of her stomach contents. It just really struck something in me. It's one thing to tell a suicidal teenager this could kill you, but it's entirely different to see the photo and know you could die like that. My father was a photographer for a newspaper when he was younger and single in the Philippines. This was martial law time under dictator Marcos's rule. He got a tip to a location where a corpse was found. He wasn't aware it was his older brother, my deceased uncle's corpse he was taking pictures of. The corpse was unrecognizable, head was blasted through. My uncle from my dad's story was a bodyguard to a politician back then. Dental records weren't a thing or reliable back then. My dad pieced it together after a while talking to my uncle's friends and colleagues, as he hasn't gone back home for a while or even called. Turns out my uncle got into the bad side of a rival ex-governor. Nobody really knew the whole story or even would touch/investigate it, fearing retribution. My dad never took a photo again after this. I was already an adult when he told me this story, when I found his storage box full of photo gear and chemicals. Not a forensic photographer, but took a forensics class. I read the entire autopsy of a horrific wrong-way crash. Seeing the driver laying on the ground swollen was horrible. I watch a lot of gory crime shows and those things don't really bother me, but when you know it's a real person, it's obviously a lot different. This wrong-way crash killed 9 people, 5 of which were kids. It was horrifically sad. For those wondering, it was Diane Schuler, and Diane. Also, more unrelated, but this really fucked me up. I saw a video, completely uncensored, of a police officer shooting a black man to death. It was the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. The way he twitched as he died just absolutely fucked me up. Whenever I see officers and their guns on their belts after seeing that video, I get nervous.